let's talk about autism diagnosis.
Okay.
One especially hot topic is self-diagnosis. And one thing I'm interested in is false positives, and also, actually mostly about false positives.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, what do you think about self-diagnosis? That's another topic where I feel like, I don't know, it's not really, we're not really being honest and strict enough. But yeah, maybe you can give your perspective about it.
Self-diagnosis is complicated for several reasons. Um, so the main point that I would address with self-diagnosis is that self-perception and perception of others is very often inaccurate. So we don't see ourselves very clearly, and we don't see others as a whole very clearly either. So when we're thinking about self-diagnosis in any, like with regard to any psychiatric diagnosis, right? Oh, am I depressed? Right? Let's talk about that. So there's a big difference between feeling sad and being clinically depressed. My profession, psychiatry as a profession, I'm a psychologist, but like mental health profession has made a set of criteria. And even if you read those criteria, you may not interpret them in a way that a professional would, because we are trained to think a certain way. We are trained um, to read the criteria in a certain way, right?
And words also have a context in yeah.
Yes. As a layperson, you don't have that training. But the professional doesn't know what it's like to be in your head. So just as well as, self-diagnosing with something can be can result in a false positive, going to a professional might just as easily result in a false negative. And this is especially true for autistic people that fall outside of the stereotypical expression of autism. It's slowly getting better, but there are a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists that cling on to training that was relevant 30 years ago. There are a lot of myths that are still prevalent, even in professional communities, and I wish that wasn't true, but it is. So I want to acknowledge, first of all, when we're talking about self-diagnosis, how difficult it is to access an official diagnosis. I want to make that very clear, that even if you have the funds or whatever else is needed, like in Denmark, you don't need a doctor and it's free. It takes a hell of a long time to get through the line, but it's free. You can also spend money on it and go the private route. But even if you then access the psychiatrist and get the assessment, you may be faced with a professional that doesn't have the specialization in autism to be able to see through masking, for example. And so you might wind up without a diagnosis or with a wrong diagnosis. And that is just as harmful. Like that is very, very harmful.
That would be
That
my next question. Yeah. So
yeah.
so what are the potential harms in? I I, I feel like I mean, I have asked this to my last guest, but are there any things that you get from having an autism diagnosis? Like, do you get any benefits from the state, or like do you get any? We've talked about accommodations. Do you get
Um,
anything like that from? I don't know.
Not from just
You
having the diagnosis. No,
okay? Well, so
no.
what would be the benefits of getting a diagnosis? Maybe we can talk a little bit of
It
that.
will give you the piece of paper that you need to apply for help.
What would that help look like,
Having
for example?
having the official diagnosis would mean, for example, that you can go to your child's school and say, okay, my child now has an autism diagnosis and they have these specific support needs. We need that to happen. You can apply to the municipality to pay for extra accommodations at the school, for example.
Hmm.
So that's what an official diagnosis will do. Very often, help like that is rejected, and I think that's true in many countries, unfortunately. Um,
What about adults?
Adults, I mean, that really depends on your situation. So you may be able to go to your employer and say, I have this diagnosis. Um, I would be more productive with these working conditions. Is there any way? And they would probably take you more seriously if you have an official diagnosis. I think if you don't have a diagnosis, probably not pay attention. But there's also a whole list of ways that that can go wrong.
Hmm. Do you see?
Um,
How
but
about?
I feel
Yeah.
like I wasn't completely through with talking about self-diagnosis, though.
Yes, let's get back to that, but maybe just as a small side note as well. Well, what about the what about a false positive? What could that? Because the reason why I'm talking about it is because
Mhm.
self-diagnosis is obviously not going to be as reliable as official diagnosis, as a good official, hopefully as a good diagnosis. Otherwise, we can basically
If you go to a specialist, then I would
yes.
agree.
So
Yeah.
then what we have to be concerned about would be false positives and false negatives, right?
Yes.
So then the question would be, okay, what's the harm that could result in that? And so we've talked about false negatives, which could result
Mhm.
in people not getting certain types of helps, like not
Mhm.
having a workplace that is accommodating, or for children not have schools that is. But what about false
But also
positives?
also having a skewed sense of self-perception.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's also to do with the false negatives.
Okay.
If you don't get a diagnosis and you were like, I really thought I was autistic, and now this person says I'm not. So why am I so like why don't I feel like I belong? Why my life like this? If that wasn't the answer, then what?
But
Or
isn't
if you get a wrong diagnosis, then you might start thinking. Um, a, a lot of women end up getting a personality disorder diagnosis instead,
mm-hmm.
and so they might think, okay, I guess I'm that instead, and then that leads them to getting the wrong kind of therapy, using the wrong strategies, and actually harming their mental health in the long term,
Mm-hmm.
right?
So
So that is a significant risk of false negatives.
I
No,
guess
it is. It is. It leads to depression. It leads to increased
no.
anxiety, and it
I,
does lead to suicides.
I agree that that's all
Yeah.
the outcome of it, but I'm not sure if that's the
Yeah.
result of the false negative. I feel like that's the result of of a false positive in whatever has been diagnosed there, right?
Um, Potentially also, but even just not getting the diagnosis and
Let's talk about
not
that.
having, not having the answers, it is very, very harmful to
It,
someone's mental.
okay, so there's okay, so just not getting the
There's significant
diagnosis,
research. Yeah,
there's
yeah.
significant research on that being very harmful.
Hmm.
Okay, interesting. Because I feel like that's really.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was a question.
Yeah,
I
there
thought
was a
that was
question. There
okay.
was a question. So is
I,
that
I
the case?
haven't I haven't seen research.
Ah,
What I
okay.
have seen, what I know is from clinical observation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't have my login to read
Mm-hmm.
research anymore
Mm-hmm.
from the
Mm-hmm.
university that expires when you graduate.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have that access anymore.
You
And
need
I
you need younger cousins that still study to
yeah,
to
yeah, yeah,
use
yeah,
their
definitely.
accounts.
Or I need to get hired by the university and teaching or some shit. Um, I don't want to. Maybe I want to. I don't know. I have so many things I want, but no, but I do see it clinically. I especially see it with older clients that come in and they've been second guessing themselves for sometimes decades, and they finally are like, okay, someone told me I should get a second opinion, and they might do that a decade after they've gotten a false negative, and then they get their autism diagnosis because they finally get to a professional who's specialized, and their mental health is so much worse than it was with the initial assessment. So then you don't end up with just an autism diagnosis, you end up with autism, generalized anxiety, maybe very often chronic depression, burnout. You have someone who is no longer capable of holding a job, for example.
Wait, because of what are they getting a worse? I'm not sure if I understood the last part.
So
So,
if someone is assessed at, say, age 25,
mm-hmm.
they don't get a diagnosis, and they spend the next decade or two
Mm-hmm.
second guessing themselves,
Okay.
wondering like, why am I not good enough, trying to
Mm-hmm.
live up to standards that are completely self-imposed because they think other people can do these things, or
So
it looks so easy to everyone else.
so in your
And they
experience, late at the late age, diagnosed people are way more prone to have a lot of other issues as well.
definitely, and especially if they've been assessed before and not been recognized.
Okay. Okay. I don't know.
Late,
It feels like kind of weird that this diagnosis is helping so much because
because it gives
because
you an explanation.
yeah, and I don't know. I don't. And now it's my turn to fantasize about a better society. I feel like it's not. It shouldn't be that way. If we talk about neurodiversity and if we talk about like us all being different and like
Mm,
this, I think it's about mutability and immutability.
mm,
I think the real relief comes from getting the confirmation that these traits are immutable and that they don't have to fight it anymore and try to change themselves. But
yeah,
I don't
it
think
comes.
I think we should be able to do that for traits outside of autism as well, right?
Oh, definitely, definitely. And I think it's odd that we've created a society that is so focused on production and perfection. It's not healthy for anyone.
So you would assess basically the so what would you say so we have a problem with self-diagnosis to a certain extent because it leads to I guess you agree there, right? That you also have a problem with self-diagnosis to the extent that it produces false negatives and false positives in a higher
Self
degree than official diagnoses, and those are
Self-diagnosis
harmful.
more often will lead to a false positive rather than a false negative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that being said, autistic people in particular tend to do a lot of research and tend to seek a lot of different perspectives before making a self-diagnosis.
But
I
the problem is that
actually,
the false positives are not autistic people, so they're not going to
yeah,
do
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And that is then the issue. Um, so, but I generally don't see those because the false positives hang out on social media. They don't come for therapy. They don't go to a psychologist, and especially not specialists. So someone who's self-diagnosed, who uh, who is a false positive self-diagnosis, they don't tend to seek professional help. Um, and they also, as I see it, tend to be people who are more so traumatized than autistic and traumatized. And that is because trauma and autism can appear very similar. So I understand the false positive. Um, for the most part, I tend to believe people when they are self diagnosed. I don't second guess most people. They have to show themselves in a certain light before I will second guess self diagnosis, because in order to assess that, I have to see them. I have to know them. I have to talk to them pretty extensively. That is why, so an assessment takes hours. You don't just walk into a room and you fill out a question. Like, there's a reason we have to see people. There's a reason we have to talk. I can't just read someone's social media posts and say, oh, honey, you're not autistic. You're this. Um, I have to see a certain amount before I even start thinking, maybe that is more trauma than autism. Or I have to see a statement that I know is patently false. Like, autism means that I do this. And I'm like, no, that's not autistic. That's actually, we know that that comes from this instead. But that doesn't happen very often. That
Why
is
do you
very,
say that the false positives are not going to see a therapist? Why do you think that?
they don't come to see a specialist.
Why not? You seem to
Um,
infer like an intentional hiding.
no, no.
No? Okay.
I don't think it's that. And I'll be perfectly honest, it's not possible for me to say how many false positives are out there because I've seen so few of them clinically. Um, the ones I have seen are usually dragged in by parents. And they're like, my kid says they're autistic, help them. And it can take a while before you're like, okay, now I see why you self-diagnosed, and I see why it might be harmful right now to tell you that it's wrong as well. There's usually a lot of cases,
Sorry,
and
you cut out there. Can you repeat that last sentence? There is usually what cases?
it's usually very complicated. Those
Mm-hmm.
cases are very complicated. They're very layered, um, and they take time, but they don't walk in by themselves. They
Is it?
usually come with family.
I know it's complicated, but is it about being partly about just getting a label that makes people accept you? And
I think people like, I think that people move towards self-diagnosis because being able to take that label and say, I feel like this explains something about myself, takes away some of the self-blame, takes away some of the hurt of not feeling like you belong, or, why do I feel sad all the time? Um, why can't I do social things the way people can do? Um, and and so I understand why people do that. And also, again, for the most part, the amount of false positives that I see from self-diagnosis, I don't think there are that many with autism in particular. Um, in part because, especially among young people, autism is not a popular word to put on yourself. It is in some circles, but I also see a lot of, especially teenagers, saying that that word is just going to get you bullied more.
Mhm. Yeah, I can
Um,
see where that this is the case in certain environments, but
yeah.
I definitely also see community and also like acceptance,
Mhm.
community, uh, this idea that you don't have to change your personality in
Mhm.
order to be fit in better, and I think
Mhm.
that's very very appealing for everyone, and especially for
Of
young
course it
people.
is.
That's
Of course
that's
it is.
insanely appealing. Like if you have, yeah, just the sense of community itself already is, I think, a big one.
Mhm.
And I think there is a lot of that would create a lot of incentives to have false positives. Um,
But I think people who seek community online can find it in many different places.
I mean,
And
yeah. Yet we have so many young people searching for it. Uh,
yes, but that's another point, is the increase in autism diagnoses. It is so rapidly increasing that I had a discussion with a friend um, a while ago, actually. And we talked about how certainly there's an increase that can be explained by a better understanding of autism. Like definitely some of it can be explained that way. Changing diagnostic criteria, better understanding definitely explains a huge part of the increase. But there's something more happening, and I don't know what it is. Um, I do still consider autism to be largely genetic, but I think we have to think epigenetics as well, and genetic triggers. And I don't know if there is so much trauma happening that it triggers otherwise inactive genes. I don't know. I cannot fathom what might be the explanation, but the increase in autism diagnoses, official, um, is so extreme that it's hard to think that it's only that we have a better understanding.
is there any? I feel like that's a pretty far. Like I think it's way. I'm not an expert, but
Mm.
you can correct me. And I feel like it's a way more studied phenomenon this idea of people assessing themselves as something in order to
Mm.
or social contagion is also a very, I think, pretty well studied phenomenon, right? Like since I think the first time it has been like this book that caused so many people to commit suicide, like stuff like suicide or depression, has definitely a social contagious uh, aspect to it. And I don't see why autism and ADHD and all of these other things should not be part of it. I think that's
It's possible. I don't know. I don't know.
mhm.
But the thing is, I mean, we also know that it's not reversible. I think there must be a genetic component, like with epigenetic triggers happening. Um,
Wait, one question. If you say genetic components, is it testable? Like in this, in the, so can we
no, because
take?
there are so many genes identified that are related to autism that it's not like we can go into someone's genetic code right now and say you're autistic or not,
Mhm,
because it's so complicated.
mhm.
Um, the last time I read about it, I think it was like 213 different genes. Um, and the thing that what we do know about DNA and epigenetics is that you can if everyone has genes that are activated and genes that aren't activated. And inactive genes can become activated because of what you experience. Everything we experience changes us, right? So our neurology changes constantly, but also DNA can get triggered to activate. So if you have inactive genes, and this is complete speculation, by the way, complete speculation. Uh, if you had an inactive gene that, if activated, would cause autism, then potentially being exposed to something in your childhood that triggers that gene to activate would then make you become autistic, in theory. And the thing is, right now, we just don't know. So far, and again, this is the last time I read it, so it could have changed since then. But the last numbers I recall from like um, studies on identical twins is that autism, like we can explain 70 something percent of it through genetic components, but then the rest of it is in utero environment, exposure to different things. Like
When you
we
say
don't know
seventy
fully
percent,
what that is.
what do you mean when you say we can explain 70%?
So the way that studies like that are done is that you will look at a certain number of identical twins wherein either one or both are autistic, and you will say, okay, in how many cases, because identical twins obviously have
Yeah,
identical
yeah.
genes.
And how? So 70 out of 100 have
Yeah,
both
it's like
either one or the other.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think it was like 73% or something like
Mhm.
that, where
Mhm.
if one twin was autistic, the other was as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
So by that, we can kind of conclude, okay, we can explain 70 something percent
Mhm.
ish with genetics.
Mhm.
Now,
Mhm.
what's the rest?
Mhm.
um, and some of it we've identified, and some of it haven't. And I think there's a lot left to learn about the causes of autism. And I want to stress that when I say that, I do not mean it as we need to discover it in order to cure or prevent autism. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that as a professional, I'm curious. Like, I want to know. I want to know. Um, and maybe, maybe there are components to autism that are preventable or that can be isolated. I don't know, but I've met non-speaking autistic people that said, "I don't want to cure my autism." Like they would type, right? So I don't want to cure my autism, but if I could speak, I would really love to be able to do that. And like I would be really interested in anything that could help us give that power to autistic people to say, if we can isolate the motor challenges that make it difficult to speak. I don't know. I
What
There are so
about
many things.
what
No, go
about
ahead.
the brain? What about the brain? Uh, can you see like y- no,
No.
no.
Autism is so complicated
Mm-hmm.
and so like there are certain aspects that we can identify. So there tend to be changes in the size of the amygdala,
Mm-hmm.
which is a part of the limbic system. Um, with regard to stress, the amygdala is kind of the big red panic button that goes like danger, danger is happening. It also has a whole lot of functions, but what we see is that in some autistic people, it is smaller and like overactive, and in other autistic people, it is bigger than in the kind of general population. We also tend to see that there are fewer neural connections, like neural pathways between the frontal lobes and the limbic system, which is actually makes a lot of sense with regards to the difficulties that many of us have with emotional regulation. Um, because the frontal lobes, of course, is the part of the brain that allows us to stop and think and
That
and
exact
to
same
say,
thing is also
yeah,
seen with alcoholics and drug addicts, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I've also I think there's a reason for that as well, which is that alcohol and certain types of drugs damage parts of the
Mm.
brain. So those neural pathways could have existed before and then been damaged. That also happens in depression, by the way. Depression damages several parts of the brain and damages specific. Um, so neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, etc. Um, they need certain gates in neurons in order to be able to pass through. And what happens in depression, for example, is that some of those gates get damaged. So the neurotransmitters actually cannot travel through the brain, which is then why we give medication to increase the amount of those neurotransmitters or to kind of force them through the gates that still exist. Um, yeah, it's so brains are complicated.